What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. Hope everyone's having an amazing weekend. I'm back to review the new flick, A Futile and Stupid Gesture. This movie came out at Sundance last year. The movie has been adapted from Josh Karp's book, which has the same name, and it basically tracks the rise and fall of comedy legend Doug Kenney, who's played by Will Forte in this case. But I should say in advance, I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge about Doug Kenney. For a lot of comedy fans, Doug Kenney is an absolute legend. While I really love the work he did for National Lampoon, and I really enjoy the movies that he wrote, like Animal House and Caddyshack, I won't lie and pretend as if I've been a massive Doug Kenney fanatic for decades. I wish I could make that claim, but it wasn't until fairly recently that I even found out who Doug Kenney was. The only reason I can even claim to have any knowledge about Doug Kenney is due to a recent episode of my podcast, Wrong Reel. Kevin Marr, Bill Scurry, and Bill Tech came on the show, and we were talking about Caddyshack, and Doug Kenney was one of the writers of Caddyshack, which, as part of my research, prompted me to watch the incredible documentary Drunk, Stoned, Brilliant, Dead, which follows Doug Kenney from his days at Harvard through the great heyday of the National Lampoon magazine in the 70s, followed by his career in motion pictures with movies like Animal House and Caddyshack before he died at age 34. Now, whether or not that was death by suicide or by accident remains in question to this day. But it's a weird situation where a movie like A Futile and Stupid Gesture, it reminds me a little bit of when they made the movie Lords of Dogtown after there'd already been a really good documentary called Dogtown and Z-Boys. One's a documentary, one's a narrative film. They tackled the precise same material, but the documentary was vastly superior to the feature film. And I feel like we have another situation like that with A Futile and Stupid Gesture, which is kind of a by-the-numbers, oftentimes bland, generic biopic about the life of Doug Kenney, while you also have this extraordinary documentary, which was so damn good, after I watched it for the first time, I immediately started it over and watched it again. In Will Forte's defense, I think he's absolutely incredible in this movie, but when it comes to the writing and directing of the movie, it's just a little predictable and safe. And this topic and this material, it really needed the energy and the talent of a filmmaker like Paul Thomas Anderson. What Paul Thomas Anderson did with Boogie Nights is precisely what was needed for A Futile and Stupid Gesture. But there are some things about this movie which work pretty well. The friendship between Doug Kenney and Henry Beard is pretty moving and endearing. It helps a great deal that Domhnall Gleeson is playing Henry Beard. I mean, Domhnall Gleeson has just been on fire the last couple of years, and he does a brilliant job as basically the brains of the operation when these two college friends are starting the National Lampoon magazine in the 70s. For people who don't know, they were friends at Harvard, and the National Lampoon have been a tradition for a very long time, so they basically licensed the name Lampoon and made it the National Lampoon instead of the Harvard Lampoon. And the movie's probably most fun where we see these guys in their entrepreneurial mode trying to get this business up and running. For National Lampoon, when it came to political humor, satirical humor, sexual humor, they were really at the vanguard in the 1970s. Comedy is one of those weird things where I feel like it dates very, very quickly, but the true gems of the comedy genre obviously last for many years. And if you go back and look at something like High School Yearbook, which National Lampoon put out, it'll both turn you on and make you howl with laughter to this very day. Where the movie starts to stumble is when it starts to recreate some of the personalities that made a lot of the comedies that Doug Kenney was associated with. It's very hard to bring in young comedians today and have them live up to the legend of Chevy Chase and Bill Murray and Gilda Radner and John Belushi. I mean, these are people who changed the comedy industry in the 1970s. We're almost kind of living in the shadow of the style of comedy they established in the 70s and early 80s, especially for people in my generation. I was born in 1976. All those giants were basically the face of comedy for my entire childhood. So to watch a movie where they try to recreate the making of Animal House or where they try to recreate the making of Caddyshack, it just feels really weak and safe and cautious and formulaic. I'm not quite sure who this movie was made for apart from diehard comedy historians, because if you're a comedy buff, you're probably not going to enjoy it that much because the movie's just not that funny. I laughed out loud maybe once or twice. I think it was Mark Kermode who said that for a movie to be a successful comedy, it has to pass the 6 laugh test, where you laugh out loud involuntarily 6 times or more. So it definitely fails on that front. But it's not necessarily a cautionary moving drama either about drug abuse and alcoholism and consumption, because obviously Doug Kenney, as his life spirals out of control, it had the potential to become one of those movies like the second half of Boogie Nights where his life has fallen to pieces. This movie doesn't even begin to approach any actual real meaty drama. So in the end, I feel like this is a movie for people who are Doug Kenney fanatics, and there are a lot of people out there like that, but they're probably going to be more satisfied reading a book about Doug Kenney or watching Drunk, Stone, Brilliant, Dead, or better yet, just go back and read some old issues of National Lampoon, or watch Animal House, or watch Caddyshack. If you want to know who Doug Kenny was, admire his work. So I feel like I'm coming across a little bit negative about this movie, and I should say I really respect and admire the intentions of the writers and filmmakers involved in this movie. They basically are shining a spotlight on a period of comedy that is as good as comedy ever was. This is a period of comedy that gave us writers and directors like Harold Ramis and all these brilliant performers that I've mentioned before. It's a wildly irreverent, sexually charged, hysterical brand of comedy that I feel like is kind of absent right now. When I look at the current crop of a lot of people making comedy movies these days, whether it's Seth Rogen or James Franco or any of these guys, it's a lot of kind of stoner comedy, whereas I feel like Doug Kenny's brand was a little bit more adult. It definitely had a hell of a lot more sex. Some of the issues of National Lampoon in the 70s have far more nudity than sex than any of like the actual like sex magazines on the racks at that time. And some might say that their style of humor was a little bit elitist. It was basically a hell of a lot of guys from Harvard. There's a great scene in the movie where Doug Kenny tells his partner Henry Beard, you know, maybe we should find some writers who didn't go to Harvard. And Beard's like, what do you mean? Like a Yaley? Like these are upper crust Ivy League humorists that somehow strangely found a way to make their style of humor translate into the biggest commercial success in comedy up to that time, which was Animal House. No other comedy had come close in terms of box office in the late 70s. So if there's one positive out of watching this movie, it'll probably encourage me to go back and study more of Doug Kenny's work. But sadly, I just don't think this movie is a very fitting tribute to all the incredible comedy legends that are featured in this movie. And maybe it was impossible to make a movie that would be a fitting tribute. What was really needed was a pack of filmmakers who could be as wild and as irreverent and as edgy in their approach to the movie as the characters they're tackling. And it's one of those things where it's almost like history under glass, where it's just a little bit too safe, and there's certain anecdotes and certain lines where if you know anything about this period, they just feel a little thrown in because they felt like they ought to. But at a bare minimum, this movie will encourage me to enjoy more comedies from this period, and I might just have to throw in Drunk, Stone, Brilliant, Dead one more time because that documentary absolutely knocked my socks off. So I hope you found this review useful. I hope you weren't too turned off by my negativity. Perhaps I'm clinging a little bit too tightly to my memories of the comedy from that period, but it really was a golden age of comedy in the late 70s and early 80s for the kind of comedy that I enjoy. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider giving my channel a subscribe. If you want to talk more, you can give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax, or you can just leave a comment in the comments below. And I hope everyone has an amazing weekend, and I'll talk to y'all soon.